Can election results be trusted in a country notorious for election fraud? Thousands of people in Mexico are saying no and took to the streets over the weekend to protest the results of last week's election, where the reigning pre-party candidate Peña Nieto won 38.2% of the vote. Leftist presidential candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador got 31.5% of the vote. The protesters are alleging that the pre-party won by buying the votes, and Obrador is planning on formally challenging the outcome of the election. So is there any evidence of voter fraud? And what will another term of pre mean for Mexico? To explore those questions and more, I'm joined by investigative journalist Andrew Kennis. Hey, Andrew, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So you're on the ground there. Tell us what you've seen from a journalistic standpoint of what's happening right there and right now and over the weekend.
Well, basically, since the pre-count election results were announced just last Monday, there's been an extraordinary amount of opposition and social fervor here in Mexico throughout the country, especially where Andrés Manuel López Obrador's support is strongest in Mexico City. There was a spontaneous protest right at the Federal Institute Electoral offices, right, when announcements were being made about a recount being done. And then there was a massive protest on Saturday that was really done actually throughout the country and all the public plazas in the country, but was shown in its strongest and biggest, I guess, example of opposition right in the nation's capital's main plaza. What happened actually after that was there was a spontaneous protest that erupted right outside of a wedding of a major Televisa personality whose name was Eugenio Derbez. And actually, ironically, Derbez was a supporter of the movement, but nonetheless, the protesters targeted the wedding as a kind of a symbol of Televisa, which is really the second target of all the opposition and the protesters. It's not just Enrique Peña Nieto, who they're opposing, but it's also the alliance that was revealed actually by investigative reports in The Guardian between the president-elect and Televisa in terms of contracts and deals, some airtime bought, some basically negotiated, dating all the way back to 2005, and with some deals, as we revealed through documents that were unearthed again by The Guardian, the London-based daily, as recently as 2009. So Televisa controls about 2/3 of the country's free-to-air channels and has really been the darling of the president-elect. And like I said, with this new generation that's connected to Twitter, to Facebook, to each other through text messaging and other digital apparatus, they're really, really ticked, so to speak, and actually are leading the protests against, again, not only the president-elect, but also Televisa itself.
So, Andrew, you're saying that it wasn't only perhaps some election fraud going on, but it was just the media monopolization and kind of putting him up on a pedestal and controlling the message.
That's definitely part of the equation, but I don't want to eliminate the other half.
No, yeah, really, go into that. I was just going
to... The protesters are just as angry and just as in opposition to the various vote buying schemes that were arranged. The most prominent of which was really with the grocery chain called Soriana. And actually, one of the few papers to cover this a little bit more critically here in Mexico City showed a picture of the president-elect, ironically, with a T-shirt of Soriana standing in front of the supermarket, holding his thumbs up. And really what was done there was that there were, basically voters organized and given prepaid Soriana kind of gift-buying grocery cards, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 pesos, both before, during, and after the election. The biggest supporters of the opposition campaigns, have been really rallying around that as being the focal point of the vote-buying scheme, and have said that at least 3 million votes were pretty much, contested and bought or coerced through those specific means. But there are other vote-buying schemes as well, or coercion schemes as well, including through the nation's leading teachers union, which also compelled or coerced many of its members to vote for Peña Nieto too. All varying schemes of illegalities, rather, that fly in the face of electoral law here in Mexico, to the point where Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is challenging the results of the election, is now bringing his case to the electoral tribunal, and they have until September 6th to decide who will be the official winner, because as of now there still really is not an official winner, thanks to all the allegations and all the controversy that's swirling down here.
Andrew, the election tribunal that's supposed to determine the outcome of the election, is there any sort of collusion going on between the reigning PRI party already and this tribunal?
Right. Well, there's no known instances of collusion, and not direct ones at least. But what we do know historically, in that the last 5 elections have been, the last 5 elections, 3 of them, 60% of them have been hotly disputed, is that the Electoral Tribunal has never returned a decision by IFE, the official institute, the official federal institute that tabulates the votes. So there hasn't been any kind of precedent, despite really hotly contested elections, even one that was even closer, and more hotly contested in 2006, of the Electoral Tribunal overturning the results. But nonetheless, this is being tried for now, because the last time around that the election was contested by, again, the same opposition candidate, there was 2 months of protests and a lot of direct action. And of course, the media turned against the candidate as a result of that, and really lambasted him throughout the airwaves and even in the newspapers as well for holding those protests right in the middle of the nation's capital. He literally grinded the nation's capital to a halt and doing that. So this time around, it seems he's taken a more kind of institutional electoral strategy. Again, historically, it really remains to be seen if that's going to work at all. And I don't think a lot of supporters are holding their breaths for that to happen. So in spite of the official, campaign not calling for protests and not being a part of it, the protests continue to wage on spontaneously and with quite a lot of energy and fervent, and almost on a daily basis in the nation's capital and beyond.
Yeah, it's hard to forget what happened last time, where so many did take over the Capitol. That was truly a momentous time in history. Andrew, I wanted to get your take on, the I Am 132 movement, Yo Soy 132. As you said, what we saw last week was more spontaneous. They have not really claimed that they started that. Are you seeing the two opposition movements kind of combining, or is it just totally organic at this point of what's going on?
I would say it's very organic what's going on at this point, because there were some skirmishes actually, and some reports of police skirmishes in front of the IFE and between protesters. And some of the organizers, again, from one of the more elite private universities called the Iberoamericana, backed off a little bit from that, and especially from another even more private and more elite university called ITAM, backed off a little bit from sponsoring or calling for protests. But it really didn't matter, because the bulk of the student protesters and of the movement really still just showed up onto the streets. These things are organized very organically through the internet, through social media, and whether or not the leading organizers at all the different schools are behind it or not, the protests just continue to happen. And like I said, in a very spontaneous manner. The energy, I was, literally on the scene in a very trendy kind of street in the middle of Mexico City in front of what's called Calle Regina and the church there. And the energy, there was just 24 protesters there at first, but literally everybody from the Zocalo kind of poured into the church area, which was about 10 blocks away, in a spontaneous manner. And the energy and the fervent in the opposition there was just tremendous. You had little kids kind of repeating what the protesters were saying, which was "Fuera Televisa," get the heck out of here, Televisa. And it really does seem, I would say, that kind of symbolized to me that there's a turning point here where the newer, younger generation is really learning that mainstream media is just not the way to go for a reliable source of information, and they're just turning to alternative sources in ways that, in unprecedented ways, and ways that are organized and really fueling the protest movement down here.
It does seem like that is happening worldwide, where there's a generational gap of the younger generation kind of awakening to the whole establishment system from the top down. Andrew, to get your take on just what will it mean for Mexico if the outcome is indeed upheld and Peña Nieto, continues to reign and PRI just goes on and on. I mean, talk about how long they've been instated and what this will mean for them to continue to rule the country.
Well, wow. I mean, the PRI was in power for over 71 years until 2000, and many critics argued that the PAN is just a more, the party that took over and won the last 2 presidencies is just a more conservative version of that. So you add up that, and that's 90 years of 2, very right-wing conservative parties ruling over Mexico with a stranglehold kind of grip, whether it's been through vote-buying schemes or really fueling, as was the case with the PAN, a very, very, violent war that's claimed over 50,000 civilian deaths just since the Calderon administration came to office. So, the majority of the country, the very clear, almost super majority of the country voted against Peña Nieto. For better or for worse, there is no runoff scheme here in Mexico. So with just a bit over 30% of the electorate voting for him, I mean, that's even lower percentages than I think George Bush won in either election. Peña Nieto is coming to power. So the whole country is really kind of gripping itself, very tense, very nervous about a return to power by the PRI. One of the most notorious acts that Peña Nieto did in his short-lived political career as governor of the state of Mexico was he authorized a very violent repression of a largely peaceful farmers movement in a town called Atenco that was literally fighting for its life, trying to preserve land that was given to them through land reforms dating back to the Mexican Revolution, that was being threatened by the construction of a new airport to service Mexico City. The movement actually ultimately won out in stopping the construction of the airport, but it didn't win out in terms of suffering very violent repression. Over 100 women were, made rape allegations. Officially, over 24 that were arrested and brought to jail, and dozens of other protesters reported beatings that, really resulted in the condemnation from Amnesty International and many other international human rights groups for the treatment that Peña Nieto dealt out, and that's just, one incident. So, given the PRI's history and then the history of Peña Nieto itself, the country is pretty scared, really, what this might mean in terms to a return to repression, and much less a continuance, because it was recently announced by the Peña Nieto campaign, a continuance of the same way that the drug war has been fought since Calderon came to office. That was one of the first announcements that Peña Nieto made as president-elect, was that he would continue the national security strategy as has been executed since Calderon took the office. So
and as we've seen, just a lot of violence rages on in Mexico still. It's just erupted. I mean, I used to live in San Diego, and it's really intense over there. And it will be very interesting to see how this plays out. Thanks so much for giving us your take, Andrew. That was investigative journalist Andrew Kenneth.
Thanks for having me on.